Okay, and for this part, our next uh, step in the journey, I'm going to try and cover a little bit more ground. I'm going to cover Sway and then see what I can do with the other two readings that were in this section. This is Opportunity in Society. We're moving beyond culture and subculture at this point. So I start with Sway because it was a very fairly user-friendly when I used it in one of my 101 classes previously. And so I thought I liked the setup and the way that it worked. It was a little bit of a test to try and figure out kind of which chapter to do because the whole book is actually pretty interesting. It's a series of stories to show as examples. So if we were looking at this, back to the idea of the argumentative approach, it's using a lot of stories, actual stories to hang some of the science off of. It's a popular work, so I don't know if you could call it overly academic, but it does have academic elements in it in the sense that it does reference some studies and some research and even some original research, but it's mostly catered to probably a popular audience, and so the authority that it comes from is really just sort of whether you recognize yourself in some of these stories and how they work in a more scientific dynamic. Okay, so the initial questions that I had going into this particular section was, do people tend to act rationally or irrationally? And that's one of the central questions within the book. And I think the book comes down on the side of irrationality more than anything else, mainly because that's what the examples are supposed to show. Um, it's about irrational risk and assessment. I use some examples in class. I also thought that it might be interesting to know how the psychology behind this irrational assessment. And so I have a link here behind irrational assessment. When you do have access to these slides, you should be able to click through. If not, let me know. So I might be able to post those as separate links. Follow up for later. Are people affected by groupthink? If so, how much? So groups, we live in society, we're interconnected, whether we want to admit it or not. If we consider ourselves lone wolves and original thinkers, that's okay in some ways, but in other ways, you might want to remember that even seemingly individualistic approaches that we take and decisions that we take are affected by unconscious biases, and some of those biases are really just not entirely our fault. It has more to do with the fact that we are group creatures. We're creatures of that are used to living in groups, so some of our decisions are affected by those groups. Whether we think we're in the group or not, we are still affected by those ideas. Um, some of the things that it talks about in the excerpts that I gave you. Something he learned in business school about that people aren't rational. That's one of the first things that they told him when he did go to business school, is that we can study the science and statistics of everything, but we're always going to push up to the idea that people are not always rational. Sometimes for good reason, but oftentimes for bad or no reason. People are just not rational in most cases. So creating a science or a statistical measure of that is going to be tricky, to say the least. He provides some examples, and this references usually the preface and the introduction. This references the preface and the introduction. So moving through this a little bit more, I have these small group discussions. Um, you probably will want to reference the book a little bit more directly, but some two terms that I think are important to understand, probably in the context of this class, but in the context of this reading for sure. But maybe, in terms of how to connect this to other aspects of the class. Value attribution and diagnosis bias. Value attribution is pretty closely related to that idea that we talked before about, how once we place a value on things, it's hard to shake that, right? And so it approaches it from different perspectives. And I don't know if it's entirely in this excerpt, but it does reference the idea that we can tackle it from two different ways, right? The idea of risk, right? Once we attach a certain value to something, we don't want to let that go, right? We don't want it to fall away. But then the other thing that we do is we invest ourselves into these values that we identify initially, right? So that they produce a bias. And so some examples that he has are NBA draft, there's a professor survey, relationships in college, and job interviews. And the reason why I broke this down this way was because that's kind of how the chapter is broken down, right? The chapters are broken down. They're just stories, right? You just read the stories, you understand the stories, hopefully, and then it follows up with a little bit of science and then some interconnectedness with this. So that's something to keep in mind, is that we tend to, the first thing, maybe not always just the first thing we hear, but maybe the first thing that we understand and we value, we don't want to shake that, right? We don't want to let go of that. And so it's important to remember that. And I do think I will probably wind up returning to that a little bit. Okay, so sorry about that choppy. Got a little choppy there for a second. The initial questions that we have here: does wealth inequality matter? Have myths about individual effort shaped the way we view success? Do we live in a classless society? All of those are basically ways of introducing this movement into the individualism side of what we were talking about before. The sway was really to identify ways that were embedded within a larger culture, how individuals work within groups. This is the follow-up and probably gets a little more meat on its bones in terms of what we were talking about before, opportunities that we may have. We may think that we're, sort of that larger myth of individual opportunity, the bootstrap mentality, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's a reference. You can Google that if you weren't paying attention to that part of class. Okay, introduction, money and success is the first section here. It explores definitions of and history of the American dream. They're based on the ideal of a classless society, a rejection of European tradition. This is the introductory section for this for the reading, for where the reading, and I don't know, both the readings are from that section, but at least the first reading is from this section. But I tasked you guys with looking at that introduction within the actual textbook. So moving on, the introduction also identifies ways that mythology of individual success was embedded within within American history and the way America perceives itself. And this is a quick walkthrough of those points. Class in America, the reading identifies 4 myths. That we are a middle-class nation. These are some assumptions that get made a lot. That class reality doesn't exist. We live in a land of upward mobility. Everyone has an equal chance of success. All right, those are the myths. Not, remember, when I reference myths, it's not myths as in they're false, right? It's that they are embedded within the psychology of the American experience, right? They're sort of an understanding of, if you were to, if we were aliens and we came down and we needed to understand sort of how America perceives itself, or maybe even we're not, even culturally, right? We have other cultures that come in and they want to understand maybe how the American idea of itself works. These are some 4 myths that we have to make assumptions about if we're going to accept some of these arguments. Reality, right? These are the realities that this reading balances. So it in terms of an argumentative format and structurally, it identifies how, it first identifies some perceptions and then it goes to realities, right? It's sort of solving its own question, right? It's setting up the question. These are some ideas that you make assumptions about, and then these are the realities. And then at the end, it tries to wrap things all together. Okay. So class in America gets a little less fancy at this point. Sorry, the slides do. A series of reality checks, essentially. That's how that kind of the reading goes. And sorry, I'm trying to kill a fly right now. So that's kind of the structural approach that this takes. So when you do review this section, make sure you understand sort of how that structure works. Class in America. It's actually pretty neat in the sense of what it does. How the other half banks, I actually just created some highlights here. about what's in there. So if I do reference a question, or if I do have a question that references, you to our task to come up with a question, or an idea from this particular section, this is a place you can go to sort of get a quick review of everything that's going on. But maybe the important thing to note is how these two readings and then the reading before it identify aspects of the individualism, right? And how we want to perceive ourselves as individuals, but yet we're sort of assailed by these other forces, these larger contextual forces of society and culture. And I think that fits, I don't know, in my mind, it fits a little bit, it fits pretty neatly with some of the other stuff that we've been talking about in terms of critical understanding, right? It's like, there's the individual and then what the individual is embedded within society. If that individual doesn't perceive himself as, I make my own decisions, right? I make my own way, right? That's not a critical understanding per se, right? Because, yes, you do make your own decisions, but those decisions are influenced, right? And so the more you understand sort of how they're influenced, not that it's a bad thing to be influenced all the time, right? We're constantly influenced, by ways that we can embed ourselves within a society. And it's not always a bad thing to be, to be embedded within a society and perceive ourselves as, as being appropriately embedded. I introduced you to a number of ways in both culture and subculture and race how we can challenge those notions, and maybe even from day one, how do we challenge those notions? It doesn't mean that we always throw out, the larger culture or the context. It just means that having a critical understanding is threatening to that, if I could use the term narrative, right? It's threatening to a single narrative, an authorized narrative. So that I think is probably more important to understand than maybe necessarily whether I'm asking you to say, well, you're this pawn in this larger game, and that's where I leave it. So it's like, oh, you should feel bad if you're going along with society. Not necessarily. I mean, it's just sort of how the way things work, right? It's how we're put together. It's how we're built. So understanding that, I think, will lead you into the thread, maybe that a lens that you could look at all of this too. Okay, so that's what I got for opportunity in society. Sorry about the little choppy recording and little mistakes here and there, but just like you, they're not, they didn't set me up for an online class, so I feel like I can make a few mistakes, and besides, it humanizes me. That's how I justify it for myself. So I hope you enjoyed this, at least as much as you can enjoy it. And I will continue later with Myths of Family. I'll probably put that into one part as well, because that's fairly recent. And then I'll see what I can squeeze in on some of that other stuff that we talked about fairly recently. But some of it I may leave for review later, at least in terms of how you access the discussion boards and stuff like that, because you guys were just embedded within it. Okay, so I'll see you in just a little bit, and have fun.